Do you believe Jesus killed animals?
I have no idea.
What's the Christ-like way to kill an animal?
I think probably the way that I do it.
Jesus said, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. He didn't say, I desire mercy, not pagan sacrifice. And that word not in Hebrew is velo, which means never. I never desired sacrifice.
Jesus had no problem telling people what to do and not to do. So why didn't he just come out and say, thou shalt not eat meat?
Well, thou shalt not kill is very clear.
The early Christians were not debating whether or not to eat meat. They were debating whether or not it was okay to eat animals that had been sacrificed to Roman gods. And throughout the Old Testament, people are eating meat. People are hunting meat. People have domesticated animals and they have hunted animals. I mean, it couldn't be more clear.
You have to take that within the entire contextual evidence of the scripture, which starts in the beginning in the Garden of Eden.
Reverend Hunter and documentary filmmaker debate the ethics of eating animals and the Bible.
What does it mean? Stop asking questions and start answering questions.
Well, I thought the whole journey of being a spiritual seeker towards God is asking the right questions. Jesus' ministry was predominantly answering questions with more questions.
I'm aware.
Kam Waters is a gospel songwriter and musician turned filmmaker and co-director and producer of the newly released documentary Christspiracy, which documents his personal quest as a lover of Christ across the globe to answer the question:
Is there a spiritual way to kill an animal? I'll put it this way. How would Jesus kill an animal?
The fact that Jesus ate fish in Luke is extraordinarily important. That should be case closed.
There's a fishiness to these stories. There's a lot of inconsistencies in the historical documentation that we have.
Tony Jones is a writer, theologian, outdoorsman, and passionate hunter who believes the lack of people currently killing and butchering their own animals for food is one of the most primal aspects of religion that has been lost.
The way that I hunt and butcher animals, I'm frankly quite spiritual about it. It's put me in touch with the food that I eat.
He's written many books, including his latest, The God of Wild Places.
Could I read an excerpt about how you do it?
If you want to promote my book, sure.
I prefer to hang a deer by the head, but for the purpose of carving off a front leg and slide a sharp knife in. What about that description is the Christ-like way?
For you to use those words that are so meaningful to me and to throw them back at me in the way you can't wait.
Did God put animals on this earth for us to eat and use how we see fit? What does dominion over the animals really mean?
My house is meant to be a house of prayer, but you've made it a den of thieves, as we've always heard it said, or a den of robbers. However, if you go into the text and you understand that Jesus spoke Aramaic, quoting text from Jeremiah written in Hebrew, it's very clear. It's paritz or paritzim, which is a violent one.
I mean, I don't want to pull rank here, but I've got a PhD. I spent my life on this. The gospel writers were not using the Hebrew. They got it from the Septuagint.
Are you convinced that we've done this right for thousands of years? Welcome to the Ellen Fisher Podcast.
Where did the Septuagint get it from, and what was Jesus quoting?
Jesus was saying it in Aramaic.
Yeah, and what did he read?
We don't know, frankly. We actually don't know.
So veganism is more so representative of an ethical position. Going back into those times, my position would be that there is a lot of questions that should be raised about the ethical treatment of animals, what Christ's position on that was. And I think that when pursuing those questions, the obvious answers that we think we would have are not so obvious. And we'll get into some of that, quote unquote evidence that he was a vegan or that he was plant-based or that he was, an animal rights activist even. But again, I would say that Jesus was way more than just vegan. He was preaching a lot of things, and particularly the ethics of how we treat others, and thou shalt not kill would be a very distinct position that not only he, but the Nazarenes and the others around at the time were discussing and debating a lot. As he said, this debate that's happening right here is nothing new. It goes all the way back to, the first century where people were talking about this and discussing this, which in and of itself proves that there was a position. And so I hope we do today have a discussion and ask the right questions and maybe land somewhere where we, can maybe better understand what that position was of Christ. Thou shalt not kill is very clear. It's in the Torah. But let me say too, because I know we're supposed to have 2 minutes here, dissecting and I'm sure he would agree with this, dissecting 2,000 years of theology and distilling it into 2 minutes is quite the challenge. I think it took you probably 4 years to get your PhD, or probably longer than that when you count it all. It's a lot of information. I have some layers of documents we can get into if we need to get into some source material, but all that to say, Yeah, we've got a dueling tradition that's happened since Jesus walked the earth on this topic. It's evidenced in the first century that the first Christians are debating about this. Why are they debating about this? Who's talking about it? We can get into all that. Who are the ones that are actually debating about whether or not we should kill and consume animals? And again, I would like to paint the picture, which I can't do in two minutes, but maybe we can do it over time, that all the evidence surrounding Christ points in the direction that he was against eating animals and against killing animals, because ritual sacrifice predominantly at the time was the way that people did consume animals, and he was clearly against that, as well as all the prophets, as well as the movements that followed. But specifically, we can get into it. I do have references that I feel personally points to him rejecting animal sacrifice. Theologians agree on this. Again, it's like he said, it's a small portion of them, but it's growing, it's ever growing. And there's text, the original, like he's going to get into, I'm sure, the original Hebrew text, the original Greek text reveal a lot more. So if I can talk about it, we can get into it.
Let's let you reply, and then let's get into that. That sounds good.
I mean, the early Christians were not debating whether or not to eat meat. That was not the debate. It's very clear. They were debating whether or not it was okay to eat animals that had been sacrificed to Roman gods.
Right.
And throughout the Old Testament, throughout Hebrew scripture, people are eating meat. People are hunting meat. People have domesticated animals and they have hunted animals. It's very clear. I mean, it couldn't be more clear. So we can definitely get into particular texts or whatever. But frankly, what a biblical scholar would say is that Kam's making an argument from silence. That Jesus never said anything about animal rights, and he never said anything about abstaining from meat. Never said anything. He said a lot of things. If he would have said it, and the early church had thought it important, they would have recorded it in the Gospels. And unless you come up with some conspiracy that it was cut out of the Gospels because the church was in bed with big meat or something from the first century, you just be like, of course, Jesus, if like it wasn't a debate in the early church, did Jesus say that or not? And it wasn't a debate among the disciples, and it wasn't written in the Gospels. It just wasn't a thing.
Okay, go.
Well, I've got the evidence, and that's why we call it Christspiracy, because it is a conspiracy against these particular texts. I truly do feel that, as well as other scholars. On the point, before getting to that, on the point of meat being sacrificed to idols and that being the issue, or sacrificed to the Hellenistic way, if that was the case, then why did Jesus stop the sacrificial system? Why were all the prophets speaking out against it? Yes, sometimes they were speaking out against it because the Canaanite worship and all of that, but they were also speaking against their own religion. If it was the case too, then why didn't they just go into Rome and start sacrificing the way the Jewish tradition did? They didn't do that. We have evidence, as he's discussing, which I guess we'll agree on, that Emperor Trajan, when speaking with Pliny the Elder, were going back and forth about how these new converts were coming into the Hellenistic world. And as they were moving in and they were kind of, secretive and meeting amongst themselves, and people were converting to this way, the temples were shutting down. The meat in the temples and the sacrifice was all shutting down. And actually Emperor Trajan and Pliny devised a plan to, oust these people, force them to kill animals in front of them to pledge their allegiance to Rome. And if they didn't, they would kill them. And there's, why did they not just say, oh, well, we can just go back to killing animals to Yahweh? Why did they not do that? They didn't do that. So Jesus said, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. He didn't say, I desire mercy, not pagan sacrifice. He said, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And that word not in Hebrew is velo, which means never. I never desired sacrifice. And we can get into the scriptures like Jeremiah 7:22, Amos 5:25, which say God never commanded us to do sacrifices when we came out of Egypt. Did God ever command us to do any sacrifices when we came out of Egypt? No, he didn't. These are multiple. All the prophets point to this. And again, we can go into this, but we have a tradition and a lineage that shows that though there is all this bloodshed, the prophets all the way up to Christ were speaking out against this, pagan or not.
But even the Essenes were not vegetarians. They ate locusts, okay? And they had in there what's called the Rule of Damascus, which is was one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, that they have rules about what kind of meat. They say this in their rule, the Essene rule of eating, which is before Jesus. You can eat locusts, but they have to be thrown in the fire or the boiling water while they're alive. And to eat any fish, you have to cut it open while it's alive so the blood drains out. These do not seem to me like animal liberationists or even vegetarians.
And when we see locusts and honey in the scripture, just want to clear this up because we actually didn't touch this in the film. When we see locusts and honey in the scripture, this is a mistranslation of the honey locust, which is the carob bean, which grows all over that area of Qumran in the Dead Sea and by the Jordan where he was baptizing people, because it's sweet like honey and it looks like a locust. And still to this day, locust bean gum comes from the carob. The carob is called St. John's bread. Still to this day, that's the other name for it. So St. John is actually eating a carob. He's not eating locusts.
Okay.
The feeding of the 5,000, the 4,000 is one of the most epic stories of the scripture. It's probably one of the most well-known miracles of Jesus that people talk about, right? However, as we all discussed, Jesus fed the loaves and fishes. Jesus himself, when recounting this act in the scripture himself, both in Matthew and in Mark, says, "Don't you remember when I multiplied the loaves?" And doesn't mention anything about fish.
So what?
And
so
when
what?
he asked them to go get food.
No. Tell me what that means, because then the gospel writers who wrote those same words wrote the stories down of the feeding, and they said bread and fish very clearly, and that there was even leftovers. So why didn't they leave the fish out of the actual story? Like, what's your point? And tell me what that means.
It's a great question. It's a great question. And I would continue that question with, why is it also not in John 6:5 when he asks them to go fetch food and says, go fetch some loaves, and doesn't mention fish?
Well, what's your point? Answer what, like he's asking, like, what would be the point of that question?
Yeah, what's Matthew doing by leaving out fish when he recounts, when out in Jesus' mouth, when he had fish in it just a couple verses earlier? Why? What's the point?
I don't know, because I'm not the writer of the verse. I'm asking the question. Do you have an answer for it?
Yeah, I have an answer for it. It doesn't mean anything.
Oh, so the Bible doesn't mean anything?
No, I'm saying it doesn't mean anything because he already made it clear that the miracle was bread and fish. That is attested across the. I mean, there's very little that's attested across 4 gospels, but this is one thing. And so, yeah, I mean, in one gospel, when Jesus is talking about it later, he only mentions the bread and not the fish. I don't know. Maybe he was doing it shorthand.